Tak dámy a pánové, máme první středu v měsíci, to znamená náš oblíbený cyklus Věda na Hradě, kterou organizuje správa Pražského hradu, Ústav organické chemie a biochemie Akademie věd České republiky a také Univerzita Karlova. A my moc děkujeme nadačnímu fondu IOCB Tech, vlastně díky kterému můžeme zvát takto vzácné hosty, jako například dnes máme tady profesorku Martie Haselton, která přiletěla až z LA. Tak my jsme za to moc rádi a dneska je to opravdu zajímavé téma. How much does sex matter? Já se nedivím tomu, že během opravdu pár minut byla tahleta přednáška zcela zabukována a každopádně ti, co neměli šanci se sem dostat, budou mít tento videozáznam, na který se budou moci podívat. Ale já bych tady dodržela naši tradici a pozvala bych člena naší programové rady, Petra Turečka z Univerzity Karlovy, aby byl tak laskav a představil paní profesorku. Děkuji, Petře.
Okay, thanks everyone. It's a great pleasure to have Martie Haselton here because she's a big figure in evolutionary psychology. And evolutionary psychology for me is one of the dominant views of human behavior, of predicting human behavior. And for those of you who don't know, Martie Haselton came up essentially with error management theory, which is something, I would say, which is the largest contribution of evolutionary psychology to evolutionary sciences in general, which is, I think, a big thing. But when we discussed it yesterday, I said, like, oh, the error management theory, everybody's so interested about it, you know. Martie said, you know, I just don't want to be the error management person. That was my dissertation, you know, when I was studying at the University of Texas with David Bass. He basically said, like, when you don't want to do human mating and mate choice, you can basically do two things now. Either you can do, theory of mind in evolutionary psychology, or you can just figure out what is this weird result from this obscure paper from 1980s. So she figured out what was wrong with the 1980s paper, and what came out was error management theory, which really nicely predicts human mating behavior. But like later it was used to all other interesting things, like how our cognition is biased, why do we make mistakes that are actually adaptive. And I think that's super interesting, not just to predict human behavior, but to predict behavior and maybe, I don't know, like biology in general, right? So she also made a huge contribution to our community as behavioral scientists because she has been an editor for psychological science, human nature, evolution and human behavior, maybe something else. I think that's enough. I will just give word to her because what she said was, okay, she also has a big book about hormones and how they predict our behavior, and that book was translated to almost every language except for Czech. So we were discussing what she will talk about, and she said, okay, I will not talk about error management, maybe a little bit. I will not talk about hormones, maybe a little bit. I want to give you a whole new idea, something that I have been working on. So I'm really curious what she has to say, so please give a warm welcome to Martie Haselton.
Thank you. Thank you for that incredibly flattering introduction. So the thing that unites the work that I've done, I'd say, is that so when I developed error management theory, the prevailing wisdom was that biases result from errors in our cognition, things that are suboptimal, things that evolution, sort of workarounds that evolution designed. And I thought that didn't seem right to me. I thought that the biases might actually be adaptive, and that's what error management theory was about. Hormones, the work that I was doing on women's hormone cycles, I also thought that the prevailing wisdom seemed erroneous, which was that hormones don't affect humans the way that they affect other species, that we as humans don't have anything like an estrous cycle. And I thought that seemed wrong. So I was interested in exploring that more. And in each of these cases, it was really exploring the power of natural selection to form adaptations. And then in this most recent line of work, I'm thinking about teaching, in essence, that I've been doing for decades at UCLA. For 2 decades, I've been teaching a class on sex and gender to incoming first-year freshman students, in addition to doing research about human mating and sexual behavior. And I've seen a lot of change over time. I've also seen views about why men and women differ that I think are, well, I'll talk about that today. That's precisely what my talk is about. And I'm pushing the boundaries a little bit again. So that I think is the thing that unites the work that I've done. The power of selection and also sort of pushing beyond the boundaries that we typically think of, not only in social science, but in the public at large. So let's see what you think. All right, so this is a classic study conducted by Clark and Hatfield in Florida in the 1980s. And in this study, Confederates, those are accomplices of the research experimenter, right? So they are in on the study. They approached attractive members of the other sex, and they said, and they were very attractive themselves. The researchers chose very attractive accomplices for this. And they approached these people on campus, fellow students, and said, I've been noticing you around campus. I find you very attractive. Would you? And then randomly assigned, they either said, go on a date with me, come back to my apartment with me, or come back to my apartment and have sex with me. All right, so these are men approaching women and women approaching men. And I'll show you the results. So there's a sex difference here. I'll just draw your attention to it. It's here in these bottom 2 cells. This is differentiated too. Saying that the sexes were evenly split on going on a date. Coming back to my apartment with me seems to have some sexual implication, and certainly coming back to my apartment to have sex with me. So men are more open to casual sex. That was the interpretation of this finding. Men are more open to casual sex than women are. Okay, that was Florida in the 80s. Does that still pertain today? So we will see. What I'm going to argue is that despite a lot of social change in how we view men and women, sexually selected differences in sexuality and aggression are large. And they're often very large, much larger than the sex differences that often social scientists are concerned with, things like cognitive performance, whether people are better in verbal or mathematical skill, for example. But when you look in domains that are closely linked to sexual selection, this is the case that I will make, you see that the sex differences are large, and they may reflect differing adaptations in men and women. There have been lots of challenges to these findings, and I'll talk both about what some of those challenges are, just to illustrate. I won't go through everything. And I'll also talk about why I think there has been an eagerness to challenge these findings or to qualify the findings. And from several different sources that I think are of interest and include some new data that we've been collecting in my lab. And I'll also make the case that this is not just an academic matter. This is something that I think the public at large should be informed about and should consider in making decisions about not only their own lives, but about things that might affect the lives of others, for example, in social policy and development of technology. Okay, so parental investment theory. It is a sub-theory within sexual selection theory, which is a sub-theory within evolution by natural selection, the broadest category. What parental investment theory tells us, so this is, it comes from an insight from Robert Trivers, who this was part of his dissertation. In 1972, there were 3 chapters of his dissertation, and each of those has gone on to become a pillar of how we understand the evolution of social behavior. I'm going to talk about only one of them, but he had this amazing burst of productivity and had a very interesting life after that point. I will refer you to an obituary that was recently written. Bob, I actually knew Bob personally from conferences, and he passed away just very recently. And one of the things that's interesting about his legacy is how his work is really well known within the field that I work, within evolutionary psychology and within evolutionary science, but it's not more broadly known. And I think that has to do with some of the discomfort that people have in thinking about sex differences. So he developed this insight as a graduate student watching male and female pigeons in Harvard Yard, where he was getting his PhD. What he observed, or the generalization that he developed, was that the sex that has, so in sexually reproducing species, all the way down to the level of sex cells, there's differential possible investment in offspring. And so egg cells in humans are large and nutritious, provide a lot of nutrients for an embryo, whereas sperm are small and don't contain much other than they're just packets of DNA. And there are many of them. So we've got relatively few gametes for females. They're large. And there's been a lot of investment of female bodies into those gametes, whereas for males, in the human case, these gametes are very plentiful and low cost to produce. So there's already a minimal investment, a minimal difference in investment, even starting at the level of sex cells. So that obligatory investment, what one must invest in order to reproduce, differs often in sexually reproducing species, and that is certainly true in humans. And when that is the case, he posited that the more investing sex, which is typically female but not always, will be choosier in selecting partners. Relatively few sex cells, be more selective about the partners that you choose, so that because you'll have relatively fewer offspring. Relative to males, who could potentially produce many more offspring, and if it's a low-cost mating opportunity, there's not much, if it's a low investment mating opportunity, there's not much cost to the male. And so he could be more, males can be less selective and potentially secure more partners. That doesn't mean that they're always less selective, but when their investments are low, they can be. The lower obligatory investment, more interested in casual mating opportunities and less selective, repeating the point that I just said. The lower obligatory investment sex will also compete, be more competitive with members of its own sex for access to the high investing sex, which is in essence the limiting economic resource, if you think about it in sort of very basic economic terms. So in humans, which sex has the larger obligatory investment, and what does it include? Of course, that's humans. And what does it include? At minimum, we're talking about sex cells, but of course that is not the bare minimum for females, for human females. There's pregnancy lasting 9 months, a huge amount of additional caloric investment, and then breastfeeding that can last up to several years and requires even more caloric investment than pregnancy. So there's a large difference in minimal reproductive investment for humans. And that results in some predictions about what we would expect in human mating patterns and in a variety of other social patterns. So let's just play this out logically. If a female were to attract 5 males within a year, so here we have a female and 5 males. If a male were to attract 5 females in 1 year, what are the potential consequences? What are the consequences in terms of offspring number? Well, potentially 5 for the male, and typically only 1 for the female, right? And so because of these differences in the possibilities for reproduction, one predicts that males will be more open to casual sex opportunities when they are available to them. So not all males will have access to those casual sexual opportunities, but when males are presented with those opportunities, they may take them more readily than women do. And that when women do have casual sex, it will be, she will still be very selective, even more selective than a male would be even for a long-term mate. So for the rare, the rare opportunity that meets a woman's preferences for characteristics that she might want to transmit to her offspring, perhaps a female is open to casual sex, but males more broadly open to casual sex. That's the prediction. We can look at a non-human animal example. This is Sooty the guinea pig. who got out of his cage. So he lived in Pontypridd in South Wales, and he got out of his cage, and they couldn't find him anywhere. His owner, Carol Freehan, said, "I'm sure lots of men," and so they looked for him for hours. They finally found him in the pen with the other females. His owner said, "I'm sure lots of men will be looking at Sooty with envy. We knew he had gone missing after wiggling through the bars of his cage. We looked for him everywhere and never thought of checking the pen where the 24 females were kept, and found 25 individuals." So Sooty was fast asleep in the corner. He was absolutely shattered. We put him back in his cage, and he slept for 2 days. So when presented with the opportunity, this guinea pig male took the opportunity, and it resulted in 24 new offspring. Okay, so 2 predictions from parental investment theory. The first we've already been talking about, and that is sexual variety seeking. So men are posited to be more open to casual sex than women are. What is the evidence for this? There's actually a lot. So this is these are data from a very large study, and these kinds of results have been replicated many times, but I'll tell you about this large study. It's a classic study that looked across regions around the globe, over 16,000 respondents, and what you see is that this is the number of sex partners. This is the number of sex partners desired over the next 30 years, so it's a hypothetical. How many would you ideally like to have? And men said more than women did. Those are the dark bars. Light bars are the women. And that number varied depending on which region of the globe was examined, but the sex difference was consistent. So the sex difference was constant, even if sex partner numbers, the preferred number, was lower or higher in a given location. All right, so that pertains to people's desires, so what it is that people would ideally like to have. And a lot of the questions that in evolutionary social science researchers ask have to do with desires. And that is because the evolutionary process, if we think about the product of the evolutionary process, it's what's happening here. This is the way station before you get to behavior, the behavioral outputs. And so it makes sense to ask, how is the mind designed? And then also to also look at behavior, but you might see the best evidence of the footprints of natural selection by looking at what people are thinking, what people desire. One reason that behavior is somewhat limiting, so we could look at the absolute numbers of casual sex partners that people have had. One reason that that is limited is that it's constrained by opportunity. So not everybody has the same kinds of opportunities presented to them. So let me tell you about some data that are consistent with the idea that when presented with a casual sex opportunity, men may take those opportunities more often. And so one of the constraints for heterosexual men is the desires of women. So it's not only what one desires, but also whether the partner that they are seeking to attract also has those desires. But if you look at same-sex couples, for example, if you look at men who are partnering with other men, where the opportunities are more plentiful, you might see desires, that increased desire in for sexual variety, that would translate into behavior. And that is, in fact, what you see. So this is gay men. This is number of lifetime partners. This is from a large study that was conducted by the BBC, over 200,000 respondents. So that's one of the reasons that I'm presenting this to you. It's such a large sample, and gay men have had 50 sex partners on average, roughly, relative to straight men who are at least reporting that they've had 8, and compared to straight women, right here, at 5, and lesbian women at 4. So these numbers are fairly consistent. Oops. Oh, this does take a little getting used to. And then if you ask, well, what if men's desires are not constrained by the desires of the other sex, but instead they are seeking partners who are themselves male, then the number of casual sexual partners increases, increasing the number of overall sex partners. So another thing we can ask is, when people have had these opportunities, how do they feel about them later? So have you ever done something that you later wished you hadn't? Or have you ever not done something that you had the opportunity to do and you later regretted it? So there are the errors of commission and the errors of omission, the regrets of commission, the regrets of omission. Here's what, when we ask people about the last casual sex partner episode that they had, how did they feel about it? This was a large sample across the United States. Glad I did it, regret it very much. You can see that heterosexual men, mostly glad they did it. Heterosexual women feel a little bit differently about that. About a quarter were glad that they did it. We also have samples of gay men, and you see that there's consistency across men here in terms of levels of regret. And it's different from the levels of regret in women. Something may be different going on with this sample of bisexual women, rather, but you get the idea. So when people have had the opportunity to engage in casual sex, how do they feel about it? And that feedback might affect then their later responses to those opportunities when they are presented to them. So it's just another angle on examining desires for casual sex. This is to show you that was United States data. These are data from the US and Norway. And you see a similar pattern. This is the percentage that regretted their most recent episode of casual sex, here, percentage here. And in Norway, women more than men regretted their last casual sex episode, whereas the same was true in the United States. Women more than men regretted casual sex that they had. What about opportunities they passed up? That reverses the sex difference. So regretting actions that you've taken, sexual actions you've taken, you see that women regret that more than men for casual sex, but the opportunities that were passed up, men regret those more than women. Okay, so I'm talking about sex differences. How large are these sex differences? To put sex differences in context, usually we're talking about an on-average difference, right? So the differences that I've been presenting to you are average levels that differ between men and women. How large those differences are have to be thought of in terms of how much overlap there is between the sexes. So a small sex difference would look something like, this is actually considered by psychological standards to be a medium-sized sex difference, but you can see that even for something that we think of as being not very small, but rather, a substantial difference, substantial enough for us to talk about. I'll give you some examples in just a moment. But there's a lot of overlap between men and women. There's an on-average difference here. You can see the peaks differ, but there's a lot of overlap between the sexes. And that is larger. These statistics are going to appear multiple times within my talk, and this is, if you'd like to know how this is calculated, it's just the difference between means over a measure of the variability within each group. Okay, and so this is the sex difference in height, corresponds to a D of 2.0, and we think of that as a fairly large sex difference. You can't perfectly predict from knowing somebody's height whether they're male or female, but if you are given that information, would you like to have that information in order to try to make a guess? You would, right? It would give you some predictive power. It wouldn't be perfect because there is a lot of overlap here, but it would tell you, it would at least get you some of the way there. There are other sex differences where the distribution, where there is a lot less overlap, and I'll show you what some of those sex differences are in just a moment. Okay, so the sex difference in sexual regret and the acceptance of casual sex offers, that's located somewhere here in this range, between 1 and 2, just to give you a sense of how large those differences are. But one thing that's very important to note, we often talk about sex differences in terms of the mean, but think about the extremes. At the extremes, out toward the tails of the distribution, either very low levels or very high levels, there will often be different representation of the sexes. So here at a D corresponding to 1.0, this would be something like the sex difference in acceptance of casual sex offers. At the extreme end of that desire or preference, men will be more represented than women. And you can see that that carries forward for larger sex differences as well. Okay, so here are some D statistics corresponding to a variety of factors. So reading comprehension, women are, if it's negative, women are higher on that variable than men. Women are higher than men. 3D mental rotation ability, men higher than women. Object location, another cognitive feature, women more than men. Number of partners desired over the life course. This is the data. This corresponds to the data that I showed you in one of my early slides. Casual sex offers. This is the Clark and Hatfield the Florida study that I told you about a moment ago. That's what this corresponds to. You can see this. Here's the D statistic, and then this is the percentage of overlap between the distributions. Right, that gray shaded area. That's what this shows here. Sexual regret here. And I will talk in a moment about some of these other differences. So that gives you a sense of, when we talk about sex differences, often the differences that we are talking about when they are outside of the domain of sexuality, they're actually not very large. But within the domain of sexuality and in other domains, they can be quite large. And this is, of course, on average. The sex differences are even larger if we think about the extreme manifestations of whatever that psychological feature is. Okay, so there have been some challenges to these sex difference findings, so that men prefer or are more open to casual sex than are women. So maybe it's because the Confederates who are approaching the undergraduates in the Florida study, maybe it's because they weren't actually that attractive. So maybe if we make them more attractive, women will be more open to casual sex opportunities. Okay, so, well, then let's give that a shot. So this is a study from about 15 years ago when I just recently spoke to my undergraduate students about this. I had them guess. And I said, but go back in time 15 years and see if you can guess. And they actually got this one right. And I went back to the paper. It was actually on my flight on the way here because I couldn't remember who was the unattractive foil in this study. I'm not joking. It was Donald Trump. I was like, this is it. This is, I mean, I had lots of things to think. But, and this was before the presidencies. So in any case, I'm not sure exactly what that means. Maybe the authors knew about what was coming and they wanted to get in a dig early. And I tried to find a young picture of Donald, a better looking picture of Donald Trump than the angry ones that we see all the time in the media. I did my best. So we've got a hypothetical scenario is what was presented to these were American undergraduates, so parallel to the Florida study, but more recently. And they read a description that was like the Clark and Hatfield study. Somebody approaches you, they say that they've noticed you around campus, they find you very attractive. And then one of those three questions. And the actor was either not specified, so I'm not going to give you any information about this, how open are you to saying yes? Or it was presented as an attractive individual, so this is for females. Attractive individuals were as depicted here, and a less attractive individual. And for males, the attractive individual was Angelina Jolie. My undergrads got that one right too. And the unattractive, and I'm not even gonna. So in any case, here's what was found. So the sex difference was it was reduced. So these are female participants in the gray and males in the black. When no information was provided, men more likely to just rate, and this is on a questionnaire, so there aren't really many stakes here. It's not like saying yes to an actual person. But when that proposer was described as being an attractive celebrity, either Angelina Jolie or Johnny Depp, where's my pointer? There it is. The sex difference was reduced. But notice that here, these are the data for female in the attractive group, are still lower than those ratings are still lower than males' ratings when the actor was unspecified. Okay. So that was one possibility. So if you make the proposer more attractive, it does reduce the size of the sex difference. But that's consistent with parental investment theory. Casual sex is not something that women are predicted to completely be uninterested in, but rather when the right opportunity comes along, perhaps. But their criteria, their standards are much higher. That's the prediction. Okay, so, but most people end up partnering with one person, at least for an extended period of time, sometimes for an entire lifetime. So maybe if we're just looking at the people who are willing to say that they are very interested in having a lot of partners, what if we analyze just more typical people? So what if we take out the extreme scores and look at medians instead of means? So the mean can be shifted by extreme scores. The median is more representative of the overall distribution. And here, these are some data. This is 200. This is about 300 people, actually from Southern California, a neighboring university. And most people want one partner. And if you analyze the data for this particular data set, looking at medians instead of means, it looks like men and women largely overlap. When you go back to larger data sets, you can analyze it in all of these different ways. So you can look at means, medians, you can look at the percentage who desire more than one partner. And for all of those, you find the sex difference still obtains. And that is consistent across cultures. So that sex difference is present even if there's variability in the magnitude of the sex difference. The direction is always the same, and in the absolute levels of sex partners that people may desire. So it does not seem to be about bad statistics. Maybe it's about outdated patriarchy. So maybe maybe we are sort of like coming out of the dark ages in terms of our interactions across the sexes, and And if we can escape from this outdated patriarchy, that you won't see those sex differences, that men and women will be equally interested in casual sex. Here are some data. So this is a replication of the Clark and Hatfield study, which has been replicated a number of times. I'm always surprised that anybody can get this through their ethics review board at their universities. In any case, this was a replication done in 2024 in Vienna, Austria. There have also been replications in other European countries, more recent than the Florida study. And you can see that the sex difference is consistent with what I showed you early on. There are more women in this study who are saying yes, but the sex difference is still present here. There is also evidence in a literature that has explored what is called the gender equality paradox. And that paradox is that in more gender equal countries or locations within countries, places where women's economic resources are more equivalent to men's, their educational attainment, their income, for example, other measures of gender equality or inequality, when in more gender equal cultures, what you tend to see is larger sex differences, not smaller sex differences. And the prevailing logic behind this, this is not my specific area, but the way that people are thinking about this is that if you have more freedom to do what you want in your life, and if you are a woman, if you have more opportunity to exercise your preferences, to do what it is that you feel more inclined to do, then you might actually see larger sex differences if those sex differences are rooted have a biological basis. And that seems to be the case. It's for sociosexuality, which is another term for interest in casual sex. It's a bit mixed. So in the 48 nations study that I showed you before, the willingness to engage in casual sex was largest in more egalitarian Western nations. There's some data in the BBC study that I also mentioned to you earlier that suggested that sex drive, which is not quite the same thing as interest in casual sex, is actually those sex differences in sex drive are lower with greater gender equality. And I think that there's an interesting puzzle to be solved there. But there are other sex differences for which this gender equality paradox holds. So personality traits. Sex differences in personality traits tend to be larger in more gender equal countries. Sex difference in risk-taking, which I'll talk about in a moment. Patience, altruism, trust, and reciprocity. Also larger when gender gaps are in GDP, for example, are smaller. And degree choice in undergraduates, so choosing to do a science or technology degree, is also larger in more gender equal places around the globe. There's a little bit of controversy about that latter one as well. But this is something that people have really only been talking about fairly recently, so we're likely to see some of the details be ironed out here. But I think that this is provocative and interesting. And it does go against this notion that it is generally that women are being repressed in some way, that they are less interested in casual sex. Okay, so I've talked about some of these things. So make men more attractive, do the statistics in other ways, look at more gender equal populations. Some of the old fruit fly experiments that Trivers, when he was developing parental investment theory, that he was examining that yielded some of the insights, those studies were flawed and they've been repeated. Those same flaws happened again, but that didn't mean that the original insight, which was that for men, the number of mates that a male more generally, a male acquires is positively related to the number of offspring that they have, whereas for females, that relationship is more flat, right? So females can only have so many. So these have all been ruled out as possibilities. So those fruit fly experiments were repeated. Make sex more fun for women, that's another one that I don't have slides to show you today. But all of these have basically been ruled out. And so what's my point? The key point is that it's contentious to the point of somewhat weird attempts to debunk this idea that there are differences in casual sex seeking. And they seem to be eagerly received by audiences. So often these findings were published in top journals, and they would sort of send the field into a bit of a frenzy, trying to figure out, well, oh my gosh, we've been analyzing it using means instead of medians all this time, so maybe our findings aren't valid. And then people go back and examine the literature and see that, in fact, that criticism was limited to the particular data set in which it was examined, for example. So, but those studies are being published in the largest and most prestigious, largest reach, most prestigious journals. So why? Why would that be the case? This is another piece of evidence, somewhat obliquely related. So this is Steve Pinker's obituary that he wrote for Trivers after his death, which I recommend reading. It was published in Quillette magazine, which is an online magazine that often publishes things that don't make it into more mainstream sources. So it was considered to be in the dark web for a while. I don't know if anybody remembers what the dark web is. In any case, I don't know that Pinker shopped this around with other outlets, but I do know that it was published in Quillette. And he actually said to me that exactly this. So there were 3 prominent thinkers who all died within a day of each other. And there were lavish obituaries, these are Pinker's words, immediately marked the deaths of those individuals, including the always wrong environmentalist Paul Ehrlich, the often obscure political philosopher Habermas, and then 2 weeks after the death of Robert Trivers, one of the greatest evolutionary biologists since Darwin, not a single major news source had noted his passing. So what's going on here? I don't think that the ideas are unimportant, but rather I think that it is that these ideas make people uncomfortable. And I want to talk about why that is the case, because I think it's interesting. First, let me get to the second prediction of parental investment theory, and that is that males will compete more for access to females. Okay, so men are more aggressive and competitive than women, especially toward same-sex others, so reproductive competition. Males will engage in this more than females will in higher investing species, including humans. One of the hallmarks of competition is differences in body size. So men are 8% taller. That was the sex difference that I showed you earlier. That D of 2.0, which was fairly large in the range of things that we were examining. But note how these body differences, as you get closer to upper body strength, the sex differences get larger, arguably because this is more closely related to fighting ability. Men are heavier, faster, higher vertical leapers, have greater lower body strength, have much, much greater upper body strength. And this difference means that 99% of women are below the male mean. Men engage in much more risk-taking than women do. Probably some of you have paid higher insurance rates than your peers because of this. So insurance companies know this, and we tend not to object as much because these sex differences are large. So this is age in years, and this is the risk of dying in accidents here in the middle line here. Disease, you can see that's relatively low, but things you can do to yourself are relatively more frequent in men than in women. And note the onset of this, right around the time of reproductive maturity. That's when males seem to be taking more risks. These are driver deaths, and this is what causes. I have twins. They're 17-year-old boy and girl twins. I haven't priced insurance for them yet to drive, but I expect that my boy will be much more expensive to insure than my girl. And I really can't object too much because I know what the data look like, right? And so this is also the relative risk here of the difference between males and female and driver death. And here is 16 to 19 years old, about the same time as that reproductive competition begins due to sexual maturity. So sex differences in violence. This is actually a slide that I borrowed from an anthropologist that I co-teach with at UCLA, Sean Prahl, who studies a variety of things cross-culturally. So men are 95% of the homicide offenders and 79% of the victims. So homicide is a male-on-male, typically a male-on-male activity. In hunter-gatherers, men are 96% of homicide offenders, 48% of victims. So that sex difference appears to be consistent with what we see in the West. Small-scale societies, men are also engaging in more homicide than women are. And there's similar things that are observed in other species, for example, in chimpanzees. So males are engaging in more of this lethal competition. Here are homicide rates across 3 different locations. So we've got Canada here, males peaking, and this is, again, age of peak reproductive, entering reproductive competition because of sexual maturity. Males much more likely to engage in homicide than females in Canada, in Chicago, and in England and Wales. And I have, what happened to that? I also have I have cross-national data. That's coming up in just a moment. Cross-national data also confirm this. So these are some data that were presented by Daly and Wilson. They wrote an important book called Homicide, where they looked at homicide statistics worldwide in order to examine things like reproductive competition. And so these are some of the data that they examined. How do these sex differences measure up? So if we're looking at upper body strength, so physical aggression, this is not lethal aggression. If it were lethal aggression, it'd be a much higher number here. Upper body strength, you can see here, fairly large sex difference. Testosterone levels, very large sex difference. There's almost no overlap between males and females. If I had homicide rates, there would be almost no difference. No overlap between the distributions of males and females. So what you can see overall from this patterning, and so these are going from smallest to largest effects. If we're looking at representative cognitive differences where they exist. There are lots of places where there are no cognitive differences between men and women. Those are relatively small differences. In sexuality and mating, those differences get larger, and they are particularly large when you ask about casual sex. That seems to be the thing that really triggers different responses in men and women. And in aggressiveness and body size, those differences are also very large. So precisely where we expect sexual selection to have shaped differences between men and women according to parental investment theory, those are where the differences are largest. And so when we're talking about those differences, we've scooted out here to this distribution and beyond, where there's minimal overlap between the sexes. And again, I'll note that at the extreme, the sex differences are very large, right? And so lethal aggression is, of course, a very extreme form of aggression. This is important for a finding that I'm going to present in a moment, and that is that there are differences in what women and men ideally prefer in mates. So good financial prospects, this is something that women prefer more than men. The cases, so this is health, kindness, intelligence, physical attractiveness, age choice. This is choosing somebody who's younger than the self. Women tend to like older partners. They tend to prefer good financial prospects in mates. Men prefer physical attractiveness and so on. But this is the one that I really wanted to draw your attention to. This is a relatively recent study. This was published in 2021. I apologize that the citation's not here. And this is something this is a finding that's been replicated many times in many different places. This is across 45 different countries. This is country level data. And so overall, if you look at differences between what men and women prefer, women across these different locations, and each of these dots represents a country. So you can see that they're all, there's a sex difference that's consistent across all of the samples that were examined. Okay. So what's going on with homicide? So this is a very extreme form of competition. Why would individuals engage in this form of competition? They might get killed themselves, or family members, if they kill somebody else, will come and object, right? So there are lots of risks involved in this sort of extreme form of competition. This is Martin Daly and Margot Wilson, who examined the homicide statistics and did some really crucial work to demonstrate that we really did need to have an evolutionary perspective to understand important things about humans, like why they kill other individuals. And here was their hypothesis about what's going on. So why would anybody ever engage in lethal aggression? Status. Because females prefer status in mates, and because your status is local, so it's always relative to who is around you if it comes to mate choice, right? Because the potential partners who would be choosing you are comparing you to local people, right? They're not necessarily, I mean, who knows what social media is doing to us now, but we're not comparing ourselves typically to people on the other side of the planet. We're comparing ourselves to people who are in our local environment. So relative status, how I feel relative to others, my relative status compared to others in my environment, how does that affect me? How does that affect another person? And so these are international United Nations data, and you can see that this is income inequality here. Income inequality can vary between 0, which means that men and women earn the same amount or have the same level of educational attainment, all the way to 1, which is that all of that is males and 0 for females. Okay? So income inequality, which is measured by something called the Gini index, is correlated with a lot of interesting things. But one of the things that it is very closely correlated with is the homicides that occur within a given geographic location. And so this is country-level data, and you can see some of the individual countries here. The United States is in the middle. Canada, our somewhat more peaceful neighbor to the north here, and so on. This same pattern obtains if you look at the data at a different level. So you can look at within Chicago, within the city of Chicago, look at neighborhood level data. And in some neighborhoods, your neighbors might be very different from you in wealth, and in others, it might be more even, right? And so that's what's being captured here. So this is, again, the Gini index based on total household income. And you can see it is very closely related to homicide rates in Chicago. Same thing is true for Canadian provinces, and this is for 50 United States. So you can look at this more granular level all the way through to this broader level, even at the level of countries. You see that when economic inequality is greater, homicide rates are higher. And you could think about what the modern environment might be doing to people right now, with increased concern about income inequality. So, many of the largest sex differences in sexuality, strength, and aggression are explained by differences, potentially explained by differences in parental investment. Certainly, that theory posited that those differences would exist in humans and that we would see them independent of particular cultural contexts, right? So those differences would appear, they're part of a universal human nature. Okay, so sex differences are political, right? Often people think that some of these findings are funny. I think that some of that's discomfort, and some of it is actually that, like, for example, the Clark and Hatfield study is pretty hilarious. But I think that there are other things going on. So I'm going to make the argument that we generally are kind and want the world to be a better place. So we're interested in being pro-social, both as scientists and as consumers of information out in the world, so as lay people. And that results in a bias in the kinds of findings that we find appealing, that maybe we remember, or that we think sound plausible, or that we want to talk about at all, or study. And this pro-social bias stems in part from at least one fallacy, and possibly from two. So I'll talk about the naturalistic fallacy to start. Okay, so pro-social bias. This is a paper that was published in Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. This is a big deal when this paper came out in 2023. And the question for the researchers was, why is there scientific censorship? So what are the things, so why are people saying that these findings are acceptable, but these findings are not acceptable? You shouldn't study those things, you shouldn't talk about them, even if you find them. And here's what the authors said. Scientific censorship is driven by scientists, students, and peers who are primarily motivated by self-protection, either protecting themselves from others who might judge them negatively for the things that they're studying. Peers, driven by scientists, students, and peers who are primarily motivated by protecting themselves from controversy, being kind toward other peers, and pro-social concerns about the public at large, the well-being of humans and social groups. Okay, and one of the things that they examined, they looked across domains. And the domains in which there's scientific censorship, the number one domain was race and ethnicity, which is somewhat unsurprising. But sex and sexuality were up there as well. Is it impolite to discuss sex differences? I think that it often is. And I think that that's a problem. And I'll make that case later. We'll see if you agree with me. But the pro-social bias depends in part on a fallacy, which is that if something is biological, if it is natural, if it is argued to be something that emanates from an adaptation that evolved over evolutionary time, that somehow means that it is a good thing. And that doesn't follow, right? Of course, that does not follow. So we don't believe that male-on-male homicide, even though we could make a compelling case for it being about reproductive competition based on the age profile and economic inequality profile, we still don't think that homicide is okay, right? We have laws that forbid it. We put people in jail. We sometimes execute people for engaging in homicide. We also don't think that the physical afflictions that we get, things like cancer and disease, that those are okay or laudable or something we should encourage because they're natural, right? So we can see that this is an example, but we can see this from examples that this is a fallacy, but there's something about making a claim about the biological basis for human nature that leads people to conclude that the person who's making that claim thinks it's a good thing. And that does not follow, right? But yet the fallacy persists, and I think that it seems to, I think it's related. I think it's related to pro-social bias and why censorship might occur. This just shows here, I mentioned that race this is from the PNAS paper that I just mentioned, that race was one of the topics that were most commonly censored. Sexuality is also here on the list and fairly high. What this shows, which I think is interesting, is that it's fairly evenly split politically. Whether people are politically right or politically left in the United States, there were more reports of, regardless of whether the person who was speaking was politically right or left, or whether the person who was evaluating was politically right or left. This is the evaluator data. So whether you had conservative or liberal politics, you were about evenly split. So there was agreement in this case. This is perhaps one of the few things that the political right and the political left will agree on. That sexuality research is a little iffy. Maybe we should censor some of that. And I think that this has to do with a sensitivity about casual sex in particular. And one reason is suggested by some of the work that we've been doing in my lab recently, looking at how hot-button issues might be related to variation in sexual strategies. So a committed mating strategy, so in addition to on average differences in interest in casual sex, there's variation within men and women in the level of that interest. And some people are more oriented toward a committed mating strategy, having one partner perhaps starting early in reproduction, having fewer overall partners, investing more in offspring. An uncommitted mating strategy, more open to casual sex, more sexual partners across the lifespan, perhaps lower investment per relationship, and maybe per offspring. So these are differing sexual strategies. Sociosexuality is something that varies, another term for this, it's something that varies between individuals. And that produces conflict. So my sexual strategy conflicts with somebody else's sexual strategy if it's different from mine. So for example, if you have a very conservative sexual strategy, the existence of casual sex-loving interlopers is a challenge to your sexual strategy. That's the idea. And these are some of the hot-button issues that we've been examining. So legality of abortion, we just had another decision in the United States restricting shipping of abortion pills in some states. That's now become even more illegal, I guess. It was already somewhat, it was already controlled a lot. But we keep having this rollback within the United States of laws that permitted abortion. So this is a hot-button political issue. It's very divisive, and it has not stopped being divisive since the moment that it has been examined. Gay marriage, which is now legal within the United States, but it was not for a very long time. Comprehensive sexual education, so that includes not only the mechanics of sex, but also things like how to prevent pregnancy, so how to properly use contraception. That would be included in comprehensive sexual education. Abstinence only would not be comprehensive, which is another option that's been used, at least in the United States. College attendance, whether people go to college, whether people think it's a good idea to send your kids away to college where they're going to party and have a lot of casual sex, or not. That is something that people have differing attitudes on, and more. And these are my collaborators. This is my graduate student, Elias Acevedo, who's amazing, and he'll go on the job market at some point, and everybody should try to hire him. He's amazing. David Pinsoff, who was one of my former PhD students, and Jamie Krems, who's a colleague of mine in psychology. So this is just a selection of some of the headlines that resulted from the Dobbs decision, which overturned Roe v. Wade, which was made abortion access a possibility for women. What happened was that the Supreme Court overturned that and turned those decisions back over to the states. This is a so-called Dobbs decision. Now it's been several years since that occurred. And there have been lots of, then there's been sort of a rollout of additional restrictions. So this is a very politically divisive issue. We proposed that it might have to do with sexual strategies. So if you're a more conservative sexual strategist and abortion exists in the world and you perceive that that allows people to engage in casual sex without consequences, then you might be more opposed to abortion. That's the idea. And that's exactly what we see. More headlines. So overall, having a more committed mating orientation, this is across 4 different samples, including in this last panel, this is a representative sample of the United States, of individuals within the United States. What you can see is that overall, being more committed in one's mating orientation results in greater opposition, or is correlated with greater opposition to abortion access. And these 2 lines, this is the blue line, which is not showing up as blue here, is the steeper line, the dashed line. And those are people who believe that. So they have this idea that abortion, the existence of abortion, leads people to engage in more casual sex. Some people believe that, some people do not. If people believe that and they pursue a more committed sexual strategy, they are particularly opposed to abortion. That's what these data show. And that is that even after we control for political orientation, above and beyond political orientation, above and beyond attitudes like that people will express as the real reason behind their opposition to abortion, such as the sanctity of life. When you ask those questions of people, even controlling for people's responses to those questions and their political conservatism, you still see committed mating orientation predicting attitudes about abortion access. So we actually think this is that what people are saying are their reasons for opposing abortion are not actually it's not the reality. That we think it has to do more with sexual strategies. And that's what the data show. We found the same thing for same-sex marriage. So in this case, more committed mating strategists who also believed that gay people were promiscuous were more opposed to legalization of gay marriage. So to summarize, political and social attitudes may not just be about these abstract principles. So our sexual strategies might have effects well beyond the bedroom. And our openness or aversion to casual sex, it predicts a surprisingly coherent cluster of political attitudes across cultures and across time. So this is emerging work. We just submitted the abortion paper for publication, and we have some other attitudes that we're examining, and we're finding very consistent results. So other people's sexual freedoms or their restrictions on those sexual freedoms, are a genuine threat to one's pursuit of a preferred sexual strategy. And I think that is in part because people have a tendency to think that if you say that something is biological, that it is somehow laudable. So the spin of sex difference findings, if you are presenting that men are more likely to engage in casual sex, and that follows from theory and perhaps as a biological basis, then that would seem to justify it, and that committed mating strategists would be more opposed to it. So that's why we would get individuals who are both left-leaning and right-leaning opposing abortion access, because their sexual strategy is really what matters here. So I think this is exciting work. I think another reason is another fallacy, which is what I'm calling the biological determinism fallacy. And so the idea is that if you're concerned about sexism, and there are these differences, maybe the differences actually don't exist. Maybe they don't exist. Maybe we just pretend they don't exist, or maybe they actually really don't exist. if your goal is to fix this problem, and there are these differences which are rooted in part in biology, then people might object. But I think that that's a very simple-minded view, a very simplistic view of how biological systems operate. Because, of course, biological systems have inputs, and if you understand how those biological systems operate, then you can change the inputs to get different outputs. So it's not strictly speaking that the case that all men will engage in casual sex, right? Depends partly on opportunities, but also depends on their own proclivities and a variety of other considerations. So it's not automatic, but people have a tendency to believe that if you posit a biological explanation, it means that something that you might desire to see change socially is less changeable. And I think that's a simplistic view. And therefore one might say, I suspect this, I don't have evidence of this, but I suspect that people are dismissive of the findings because they are conflicting with both their understanding of their committing of the biological determinism fallacy and their interest in fixing sexism, which I'm interested in fixing too. Or at least it should not be widely known. So this should not be part of polite conversation. And I experienced this studying women's sexuality and its connection with hormones. I got involved in studying this in this area because I thought that what we were seeing in non-human animals could be imported into our understanding of humans, and we might generate a lot of new ideas and get some insights into the things that connect our hormones with our sexuality amongst human females. And it generated a lot of sensitivity. There was a lot of controversy. People believed that if we showed that, for example, women's political preferences might somehow be tied to their hormones, there's not much evidence of that, but it generated a huge furor when a research study that made that claim came out. Of course, men's political preferences might be affected by their hormones, but people were less bothered by that. By that idea that testosterone might be related to their political preferences. That's just one example, but there are many. This ended up being much more controversial than I expected, and it wasn't just because people thought that humans were exceptional relative to non-human species, that we didn't want to believe that the same biological processes that affect behavior in other species would affect us, the human exceptionalism idea. But it was more than just that. Okay, so why do I think this matters? As a scientist, I would like us to get the answers right. I think it's more interesting when we get the answers right. But that's just an academic perspective. I actually think that there are lots of costs of getting this wrong. And this is where I start speculating. I don't have a lot of data to show you that are my own. But rather I'm piecing together what I'm seeing out in the world. And I think that if we had a greater appreciation for some of the ways in which men and women differ, if we understood the origin of those differences and exactly how they are implemented, how they operate in our minds, then we might be able to avoid some of the negative consequences that could potentially result from not understanding those things. Okay, so for example, in biomedicine, women are behind men, and this is for a variety of reasons. Some of them having to do with differences in biology, but others having to do with males just being treated historically as the default. If you understand males, then you just scale it down. Females are just small males, so we can just scale it down and that'll be fine. And they don't have annoying menstrual cycles, which mess up the data. That's the biological concern. But it has become increasingly apparent that women have suffered under treatments that were only tested on men. So Ambien, the sleeping pill, not only do you have to scale it for body size, but it has much different effects in males and females' brains. So, and there were examples of people who were taking too much of the drug, going grocery shopping and not remembering doing that, and for a variety of other interesting things that were happening, but they were happening more often to women than to men because we didn't understand how to scale the dosage because those drugs were tested on men but not on women. Similar is true for heart disease as well. And if you think about adaptations within the body, adaptations within the body for reproduction, within female bodies, bodies get remodeled for reproduction, during pregnancy, and they sort of get unremodeled after pregnancy. So this is a lot of change. And it makes sense that heart disease might be related to differences in reproductive biology, difference in reproductive adaptations, because women have to circulate a lot more, so their circulatory system has to be redesigned during pregnancy, whereas males don't undergo that sort of redesign. So the predictors of heart disease are different in men and women, and the treatments are different in men and women. Recognizing this, there have been a couple of National Institutes of Health in the United States policies that were to address this gap. In 1993, the Revitalization, so-called Revitalization Act, required equal representation of females and males in research, whether you're looking at cells, mice, or humans, the full range of individuals. So that was required in 1993. In 2016, sex needed to be included sex as a biological variable needed to be included in analyses. So for example, if you were testing the efficacy of sleep medication, you would have to include males and females, analyze them separately, and see if things like the dosage differ, not just based on body scale, but other considerations. So that became the policy from NIH. And NIH funds most of the biomedical research within the United States. So we should see a shrinking, then, of a gap in our biomedical knowledge since the advent of these policies. But that's not what we see. In 2003, a decade after requiring equal representation of males and females, males are still studied exclusively almost 6 times as often in neuroscience, 5 times as often in pharmacology, about 4 times as often in physiology. In 2019, 58% of studies failed to present analyses by sex, compared to 50% in 2009. So these policies, although they were enacted, they seem to have had somewhat limited effects. And I don't think we know exactly why, we just know that those effects have been limited. Oh, and then we have this. So the first thing that in the more recent election, Trump election, was the first day was an executive order that declared that there are only 2, and this is the term that they use, 2 genders. And as a result of this, a lot of grants were canceled, including those that we're examining things that really you wouldn't think of as falling under this umbrella, but the canceling of grants was so broad to have included things that merely mentioned women, right? So those grants got canceled. So the things that were there, the studies that were there to potentially address this gap were being canceled. Female, and certainly the term gender. So I have colleagues that had their grants canceled for these reasons. So to the extent that we were making progress, we have hit another road bump. So our deficit in understanding reproductive adaptations in the body and brain is persisting, and I think it comes from a variety of sources, including whatever biases are driving the study of males to the exclusion of females in biomedicine. Okay, in social policy, within the United States, and also globally, more women than men are entering and completing college degrees, college and post-secondary degrees. And so you can see this change over time here from 1970, where more men than women were enrolling in college, 60-40. That's basically flipped. If you carry it further out, it has continued to increase. So more women than men are going to college and getting degrees. I mentioned that the mate preference finding across nations, that women more than men prefer resources in mate. This is a recent study, just came out this year, asked put people in different kinds of scenarios. So assigned them to have a personal income level, and also assigned them to be in an ecology where either males or females were in more control of resources. And that varied from, so you could be anywhere, if you were an individual in this study, you could be assigned an personal income anywhere from the 10th percentile, meaning that only 10% of the people in the population were lower than you in income and 90% were above, all the way up to 90, which is the reverse. And also the local economic inequality. So whether men tend to earn more than women, ranging from 2-to-1 female to 2-to-1 male to female. And a variety of things examined in this study, but I'll just show you one of the outcome variables, and that is the preference for a partner who makes more money than you do, hypergamy. So seeking somebody who is greater than you on some level, and this is on some variable, and this is income that I'm showing you. And what you see is that here we have men making twice as much as women. We have men making 1.5. This is an equal amount, and in the equal category, women still prefer resources in a mate more than males do. And it does flatten out at the higher levels. So when women make twice as much, you get to about equal levels of preference for economic inequality, for economic resources in a partner. So how is this affecting boys and men? So we have lower college attendance by boys. We have lower potential financial success for boys than for girls. How might that be? What effects might that be having? And we've seen, we've had a couple of popular thinkers who've been talking about this a lot. So this is Richard Reeves, who wrote a book called Boys and Men, and he's been on a campaign across the United States and elsewhere to talk to governments about doing things to elevate boys and men, because the idea is that boys are being left behind. So in our efforts to elevate the success of females, boys may be being left behind. That's the idea. And that's certainly what Richard Reeves is claiming. It's also what Scott Galloway is claiming. He's a business school professor at NYU, and this is a recent book of his, and he's been talking a lot to a lot of people about these ideas, as has Richard Reeves. And they've had a lot of impact. So Reeves, for example, has gotten governors of states within the United States to enact more programs for boys and men, being concerned that boys might be being left behind. Sort of like what happened in the early 1900s when these concerns came to the fore for a variety of reasons. And there were programs that were developed specifically for boys. And so in the United States, an example of that is the Boy Scouts, which is no longer the Boy Scouts in the United States. Now it is called BSA, for Boy Scouts of America. And it is for boys and girls. And I know this because my daughter was in BSA. And I asked her at one point, would you rather be in the Girl Scouts or BSA? And she's like, definitely I want to be in the Boy Scouts. They go on more hiking. So they go on more camping and hiking. So in any case, there was concern about boys being left behind socially early in the 1900s. And now this is coming to the fore again. At least it's being claimed that boys might be being left behind. And some of the statistics that these thinkers are citing include that just in general, teenagers seem to be not getting together as often. So the age at which teenagers first have sex, or the age at which humans first have sex, is declining. I'm sorry, it's rising. So, and the number of partners that individuals have presumably is declining. This is age at first sex. Ever having had a relationship is also declining. For men and boys, ever having approached a woman to express interest in her, to flirt with her, maybe ask her for her phone number, that has been on the decline. Scott Galloway's been talking about that a lot. So something might be going on. These secular trends might be telling us something about what's happening in human mating in the modern world. So birth rates are also on a global decline. Lots of different possible explanations for this, and possible explanations for the decline in sexuality overall, including that people are much more screen-mediated in their social worlds. So I'm not going to claim that differences in social activities of boys and girls, and specifically in achievement in college, at the college level and beyond, but I think that might be one factor. I'm not going to claim it's the only factor, but I think it might be one factor. We do have check data here. But the trends look very similar across different places within the globe. Okay, technology. So we are undergoing some rapid change. It's a bit head-spinning. So computer-mediated, online-mediated forms of meeting and socializing. This is novel. This is evolutionarily novel. This is not the way that we did it throughout our species' evolutionary history. This is something new, and it may be having a lot of effects on us. Here is a really remarkable study that was just published looking at how the introduction of Tinder, which is one of the swiping apps where you can swipe to choose mates, and apparently abundant mates, right? So if you can swipe really, really quickly, then you can find out just how many mates there are, and there are potentially many. When Tinder was introduced on college campuses, it was introduced in fraternities and sororities, which I think is really fascinating. I did not know that before I read this paper. But that produces a really interesting natural experiment, because you can look at the rollout over time of Tinder within these locations, and you can look at the students who had access to Tinder, who were involved in fraternities and sororities, versus those who were not. We've got a million plus individuals in this study. Let's see and it comes from a broad survey. So what did the introduction of Tinder do? It produced more sexually transmitted infections, and it produced having more partners. So the percentage of individuals, so this is percent change relative to pre-Tinder baseline, right? So before Tinder was introduced in one of these environments. And how much did it increase the number of sex partners that you had within the past year? About 30%. So STDs, about the same, but not things that were indicative of long-term relationships. So relationship problems, setting that aside, but being in a relationship or not did not seem to change things. So meeting more people didn't translate into entering a relationship, also cohabiting, right? So it's selective in its effects. There's also a so-called superstar effect, such that if you were somebody who had sex partners before you had Tinder in your hand, you had a lot more sex partners after that. Whereas if you were relatively low in your sexual history, if you had a relatively scant number of partners in the past, you didn't necessarily meet anybody new. And this is just the data for men. This trend is flat for women, but for men who had many sex partners before Tinder, they had an increase in sex partners after the introduction. So this is 7+, 8+, or 9+ sex partners in your sexual history in these college students. They were the students who seemed to be the so-called superstars. That's at least the researchers' interpretation of these findings. I think that's really interesting. That suggests that there's going to be greater sensitivity or greater feelings of inequality in access to mates. And I've actually had young men, my students at UCLA, say these things to me, and I found it perplexing the first few times that students were commenting. They said, well, what about this notion that there are just a few men, there's just like the 10% that attract all of the mates and everybody else is left behind? And I said, I don't think that's true. Well, and then I saw these data. So I haven't shown this to my students yet, but I'm going to next week, because we're going to talk about online dating in my class, which is all about the modern world clashing with our evolved adaptations, mating in the modern world. So we'll see what they think. I'll ask them to predict these findings, and I think that they may get it right. So there does seem to be, it's creating certainly the experience within people who are using this app that there are the haves and the have-nots. There are those who are successful in attracting mates and not. And this is being exaggerated, accentuated by the existence of meeting people, computer-mediated meeting. And one of the things that I think, I'll come back to that. So what might be some of the outcomes here? I'm not going to claim that this is the sole cause of the increase in loneliness, but I think it's related. And the reduced partnership formation, that was not something that was the outcome of using the online dating, but the casual sexual experiences did seem to be increased. That might translate into lower feelings of connection with others and greater loneliness. So there's quite a lot of discussion of this. The U.S. Surgeon General made the claim that loneliness was one of the things that we needed to be most concerned about in terms of health moving forward. Loneliness actually raises mortality risk to the equivalent of 15 cigarettes per day. So that seems pretty remarkable. Seems like it's translating into certainly risk for a variety of maladies: cardiovascular disease, dementia, stroke, depression, anxiety. And the WHO declared just a few years back that loneliness is a global health priority. Addressing loneliness is a global health priority. Okay, so I've described sex differences across a variety of domains. I've described to you some of the resistance to discussing, certainly to studying those sex differences further. And I've discussed some of the consequences that may follow from our not understanding that these differences exist. And this is just the same series of effects here, and you can see that things that involve, again, sexuality and competition are the places where sex differences are largest. And some of the other data that I showed you suggest that things like economic inequality, or the sense of economic inequality, or the sense of variation in the ability to attract a mate, that those are being accentuated in the modern world for a variety of reasons. Economic inequality actually is rising. And so, because there's such a strong connection between economic inequality and potentially deadly forms of aggression, that is something that people may be very concerned about, and rightly so. Sex differences in aggression and sexuality, they may be underestimated or dismissed, and I've described a variety of things that I think are producing that, including that people's sexual strategies are in conflict. And that might mean that people want to manage the information that is out there about what other people are doing, and what is okay or not okay. And so whether something has a biological basis, if people infer then that means that behavior or behavior or preference is somehow desirable, that may be something that people object to because their sexual strategies conflict with the existence of casual sex. And I think that ignoring these differences leads to a variety of things. I've just described 3 of them to you today, but addressing this gap in biomedicine. I think it's really important that we understand differences in reproductive adaptations in the brain, but also in the body, but also in the brain. So I think that that's really important for us to study, to address that gap in our biomedical knowledge. Inattentive social policy, so for example in education, so 60-40, that is the sex ratio across universities within the United States. Why are admissions committees not balancing that out more? Maybe it's because the applicant pool is just not there, but that means that there might need to be recruitment efforts if people are concerned about these things. So if we're concerned about the overrepresentation of one sex relative to the other, which has an impact on mating strategies. So if there are relatively abundant females within an environment, which is the case on college campuses, then they will accommodate male interests. if there are relatively abundant males within a population, they will accommodate female interests. So the rarer sex really can make the rules. So what are we going to see as a result of this 60-40 divide? I think some of it we're already seeing, but I think we can expect it to continue. And people are not talking about this. People do not even my fellow parents don't talk about this. Even my fellow parents who are evolutionary scientists. I'm like, I'm going to look at the sex ratio when my kids apply to college. I'm concerned about this. I don't think I want to send my daughter to an environment where females feel very competitive with one another because there aren't very many males around, assuming heterosexual mating, of course, which is another topic. Is what might be happening with the increase overall in same-sex sexuality. Might be a result partly of this. So what do we think about that, creating that kind of an environment? Are we concerned about the social consequences? Well, if we're not even talking about it, we certainly can't explore what the consequences might be. So I think that we have inattentive social policy to the existence of these sex differences and the existence of the environmental triggers that can produce sex-differentiated behavior in one direction or another. And inattentiveness to the effects of also technological change. So I talked only about online dating, but I actually think that there are a variety of ways in which technology is affecting humans that we are not thinking through. And we're not thinking through it with respect to differences between men and women. We've now begun to see in the United States that social media companies are being held to account for teenagers having some negative impacts. And they're being held to account, and people have been successfully suing. So there have been 2 cases in the state of California where young women have been able to sue social media companies because they were overtaken by their social media feeds and made to feel like they needed to achieve a standard that was not possible. So, for example, feeling that their bodies were not measuring up, so to speak. So I think there are a variety of things that we should be really thinking through as technology just has accelerated, technological change has accelerated at a pace that is concerning. It certainly is concerning to me as somebody who works with undergraduates. I see a new set of undergraduates every year. I've been seeing these students for now a couple of decades. And with kids and with their teenage friends around and hearing what's happening with them. So I think we need to pay attention. I think that pretending that sex differences don't exist doesn't help. And I think that we need to study these things more intensively. If what we want is social policy change, then we need to understand how to change the levers in order to change human behavior. And we, by not exploring the biology and the evolutionary logic of these facets of human nature, then we are missing out entirely on information that might help us make better decisions, depending on what our goals are. And that is all. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay. Perfect. I must say that as a male very interested in male-to-male competition, I'm really happy that these other males are suffering. But, let's see what the audience have to ask. So please raise your hand and I will pick interesting people. Okay, lots of...
Thank you very much for a nice talk. And I think that you as a biologist or maybe medical doctor, you pay too much attention to the biological factors, but at least here in Czech Republic we have a very strong social factor, namely that after the changes of '89, so in the 90s, actually schools became women clubs, so that actually they are for girls because they are to teach. All the teachers are women,
right?
And so they introduce a culture in which to be quiet and to be nice, etc., is a positive thing, and so. they admit also boys to the schools, but basically the school is for girls.
Right.
And I think this explains, in my view, very much these changes in
that schools are more designed for female than for male
for girls.
behavior?
Yeah, they are very strongly. That means the behavioral patterns, the way of education, how the school programs is designed. Everything is based on a women perspective. And I think that the boys feel very badly at schools.
Yeah.
And so they don't choose their career in going more years to school because they don't feel there well. And so they are not willing to attend.
Yeah. So if we
colleges.
design schools to boost up female performance, then male performance might fall because we're meeting female preferences and not male preferences. So, for example, being able to sit still for an entire school day, that might suit teenage girls more than it suits teenage boys, and then boys may not continue. That is something that people have been talking about. There are same-sex education settings, and I think that those are one possible avenue for increasing participation of boys is having a more, or at least thinking through what would make an environment more conducive to boys' learning and their interest in being in school. So I think you're absolutely right.
Employing males as teachers because we don't.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that's one of Richard Reeves' main claims is that we need more male teachers so to serve as role models. There isn't actually a strong association, as I understand the data, between the existence of more male teachers and boys performing better. So maybe other things besides just having the presence of male teachers. But I certainly feel like that should have an impact. So my intuition is similar to yours, but so far the data are not supporting that. That just increasing male presence in the classroom is going to help boys.
Okay, interesting. As a male very interested in competition, I was very happy in school because there were authorities to subvert.
Authorities, yes.
Interesting. Jakub Steiner has a question.
So you have described many observable differences between men and women, and that was very convincing. And then you have strongly hinted that those have biological basis, and you have described biological mechanisms that could cause them, and these are plausible. Yet there are many other mechanisms that could cause them: economic, socioeconomic, cultural. And I wonder what would be a methodological way of distinguishing between those competing explanations. Like how can we make a progress on nature versus nurture?
Right, nature versus nurture. Well, I think it's not going to be an either or. It's always going to be, any biological system has environmental inputs, or at least when we think about biological systems at the level of the human mind, that those systems, even if they've evolved over evolutionary time, they are sensitive to environmental inputs. So I think that you have to specify what you think the adaptation does. So for example, with homicide rates, if you think that lethal male aggression one thing I failed to mention was that Daly and Wilson, when they went through and looked at the records, what they saw was that it was usually trivial altercations. These are their terms, their words. Trivial altercations concerning status that were resulting in aggression that could sometimes bleed over and lead to deaths. And so, for example, in cultures where there are lots of guns available, so in the United States is an example of that. You wouldn't know without that theorizing to consider economic inequality, but that's a social factor. But that hypothesis, so it's not ever going to be the case that it's 60% of the causes are biological and 40% are environmental. Rather that the adaptation is based in biology, but there's environmental input. But we don't understand how that environmental input. What it is sensitive to, what the adaptation is sensitive to, how it processes that information, and how it produces variable outcomes, unless we are exploring what the functions of those adaptations are. So I think you kind of have to take it on a case-by-case basis. I can't give you a global, satisfying answer to the nature versus nurture question. I wish I could. That would be an amazing innovation. But I think that we have to get specific. I think that we need to ask ourselves, what is the biological basis for male-on-male aggression, and then explore the things that might increase it or decrease it. so that we could examine the social factors. Does that make sense? Yeah.
There was a question, gentleman in the back, I think. We need to run the microphone around the crowd. Yeah.
But I hear what you're saying, that yes, absolutely. I've been emphasizing the biology part because I think it's been neglected. But the better we understand the biology, the more I think we know what social factors to look at.
Next
Hello.
question.
Question here in the back.
Yes.
Thanks for such a cool presentation. I've got about 100 questions.
Okay.
But maybe just two, if I may. You've been talking about sex as a very binary thing.
Yes.
And I was going to ask, is it really? Or
Yes.
is it more of a spectrum, as we like to say nowadays? And how does that play
Right.
into your findings? And maybe squeezing
When I talk about sex and gender, when I teach about this, I teach about gender as something that is more of a spectrum. So masculinity and femininity exist on continua, right? So we can define those in such a way that we can identify more or less male typical, more or less female typical qualities. Whereas sex is binary. If we define it at the level of function, if we think about it from a biological perspective, then we can, and this is how biologists do it, regardless of whether they're studying humans or non-human species, or even non-mammalian animals and plants that have sperm and egg. Sperm and egg define male and female. And so that variable is binary. There's no functional morph in between. There's no in-between morph between sperm and egg that does something reproductively. So if we think about it from a biological perspective, from a functional perspective, the question is, what are the morphs that are involved in reproduction? And there are two. They're male and female. That has become a very controversial thing to say. And it's actually resulted in people I know being fired from their jobs. So we'll see what happens when I get home.
We won't tell anyone.
Okay, yeah. Just yeah. And so I think that this idea that sex is a spectrum, some of that is informed by really interesting things that are happening in biology. So female bodies sometimes have functional male cells within them. So female bodies that have reproduced and have had male offspring, or at least have had male conceptuses within the body. There are some of those cells that can be retained, creating what's called mosaicism. So this is a combination of male and female cells within the same individual. So that is hard to square with this idea that there's just two, right? So that's a very interesting phenomenon. But in terms of function, in terms of what is required for reproduction, does mosaicism negate the fact that sperm and egg are the two at the most basic level of biology, those are required? It does not. And there are many other things that are biological variables that do differ, that do differ in a way that looks more spectrum-like. But it's usually social things that we think of as more of a broad spectrum. So whether somebody behaves in a feminine way or a masculine way, the level of pitch of somebody's voice, how tall somebody is, right? Those are things that are variable. Some of those are social in how we present ourselves, and some of them are sex-linked, meaning that the differences are triggered by factors that are traceable to sperm and egg, or maybe XX and XY chromosome. But they're just sex-linked. So there are other causal factors that also affect the variation. So you're going to get a spread, even though there will be a difference, right? You'll still have those overlapping distributions for a lot of these qualities. So if we define sex in terms of sex cells, it's binary. If we define it in other ways, it's not. But I think that most people are thinking about gender-related concepts when they're thinking about a full spectrum. One thing I would like to say is that I think that this idea that sex is a spectrum, it comes from a place of people wanting to see more inclusion. That people want to see, for example, that transgender individuals are not excluded from these definitions, that intersex individuals, so people who are born with phenotypes that are somewhat in between, they're not born in between sperm and egg, but rather they may have they may have incomplete androgenization over the course of development, or incomplete feminization over the course of development. And so when born, some babies have ambiguous genitalia. I have a colleague who I used to teach with for many years at UCLA who ran an intersex clinic, and this was exactly the kind of case that he examined. So I think that broadly there are these individuals out in the world, and that there's been sensitivity to defining things in such a way that it would seem to define them out of existence. I don't really see it that way, and in fact, I think that tying the definition of sex to a particular scientific finding, so for example, mosaicism, that there is this combination of male and female cells that can reside within a female body, defining it in terms of something like that, and saying that therefore we should grant this broad spectrum of people equal dignity and equal rights because of that scientific finding. The risk there is that the scientific finding gets overturned, and then do we fail to grant those rights? Instead, my view personally, and this is not as a scientist, just personally, my view is that we should give all people dignity and rights, and it should not matter what their sex cells look like, or whether they are XXY as opposed to XY. Did that answer your question?
Absolutely, yeah.
Awesome. Last question there in the corner, and then we will need to leave it or postpone it to the couloir debates.
I really appreciate the question, though, so thank you for asking that.
Okay, hello. I'd like to ask if there's an evidence of sex-driven influence on recent electing of these macho totalitarian leaders in the world, and even if hasn't been any studies on this yet, could you please share your view or your feeling about it?
I have no idea. I'm shocked every time.
Thanks.
So I don't know. Maybe I need my smarter political scientist friends who know more about the data to speculate about this. But it could be some of these rapid social changes that we don't fully understand how they are affecting our human psychology, and maybe they are causing us to want to find a so-called strong leader, and we end up with leaders, some of these totalitarian leaders who have recently been elected. I wish I knew the answer to that question, though. That seems like it'd be useful to know.
Okay, cool. We can speculate about it more in the back of this beautiful space.